Good morning. How are we doing today? It should be Friday, March 20th while you're watching this. At least I certainly hope you are at that point. And today, guys, we're going to be moving into Unit 7. So, Unit 7 is a big unit. A lot of stuff happens in it that's really critical for us to address. And it makes me incredibly sad that we're not in the classroom so I can teach this with you guys in front of me. There's a number of activities that I normally like to do with Unit 7, like I said in my intro, but we'll come up with a good way for us to do this. So I hope that you're all doing well. I hope that the first week of online schooling wasn't too chaotic for you. And I'm very proud of how you guys have been doing so far. I'm really proud of how diligent you've been about trying to get all of your work done for me and how well you've been communicating. So thank you so much, guys. Reach out if you have any problems. And once you finish this, happy weekend. So today, what we're going to be talking about is the beginnings of a movement known as the Italian Renaissance. Now, you have probably heard of the Renaissance before, but today we're going to get into exactly what that is. So here we go. So the first thing we are going to be talking about is, why is it the Italian Renaissance? Why isn't it like the German Renaissance or the English Renaissance or the Nigerian Renaissance? Like, why are we talking about it in regards to Italy? Why doesn't it happen somewhere else? So the first thing we have to do is define our terms. Like always. So, quite literally, Renaissance, however you want to say it, Renascimento, if you're going to be Spanish or Italian, quite literally means rebirth. That's what the word means. It can also be kind of translated as revival, but I like rebirth better. And Renaissance in this context is really talking about a return, a rebirth of an emphasis on classical Greek and Roman ideas, as well as arts. So if you remember all the way back to Unit 2, when we were talking about classical Greece and Rome, this unit is going to echo back to that, at least for the early portion of this unit. And essentially, what it's positing is that there's this period of enlightenment, quasi-enlightenment, during the classical era in Western Europe. And then you have the Middle Ages, and things kind of go pear-shaped. Things go wrong during the Middle Ages. Or at least that's kind of the narrative that we often hear. The Middle Ages weren't that terrible, frankly, except for the plague. But the Renaissance is when you start to see kind of this movement in terms of intellect and artistic production that is really transformative. But one thing we have to remember is that the Renaissance primarily influenced the elite. It mostly affected people who were super wealthy, and people who were kind of in their orbit. So the Renaissance deeply influenced things like art and literature, as well as base levels of literacy. It affected the structure of politics, the way people thought about the construction of buildings. But if you were a peasant, the Renaissance really didn't change all that much about your daily life. So poor people were not very affected by the Renaissance. And this is something that we always have to remember, is that yes, the Renaissance was deeply important in terms of what it does culturally and intellectually to populations in Western Europe. But that population that is able to be affected by these cultural and intellectual changes is really, really small. We are not talking about like 90% of the population. We're talking about like 15. So, why did the Renaissance begin in Italy? Well, partially because remember those Crusades? Remember how everybody came into Italy in order to do business? Yep, that resulted in an increase in trade and commerce. And Italian city-states started to kind of achieve this reputation for being a good place to do business. Also, think about the actual geography of Italy. It juts down into the Mediterranean Sea, so if you're traveling by sea, it kind of runs straight into it. And that makes it pretty convenient for trading purposes. So the other thing to remember is that feudalism in Italy was never never as strong as it was in, say, like France or the Holy Roman Empire. And so as a result, you didn't really have these large states developing. You didn't have large kingdoms developing. Instead, what you had was these small city-states develop. The other reason why the Renaissance begins in Italy is because, like, if the whole thing about the Renaissance is re-examining and reappreciating the ruins and the effects of classical culture, then the people who live closest to like the ruins of the Roman Empire are going to perhaps have that greatest connection to it. So what occurs is that you have this notion that like people are quite literally living in the ruins of ancient Rome. And so they know exactly what the Western European portion of the Roman Empire used to be. And they kind of want to rebuild that if they're able. So here's a 19th century depiction of people living in ruins in the Roman era. I just like the picture. There we go. So other reasons why, well, like I said, you have these city-states that become incredibly wealthy due to trade. And a lot of different city-states become wealthy, but the wealthiest and most important city-state of all is undoubtedly Florence. So Florence is the heartbeat of the Renaissance, at least initially. Venice, which is farther to the east and is on the coast, became a shipbuilding mecca, became a place where a lot of sea trade occurred. Genoa became a place of a lot of fabric production. Milan was known for weapons production. And all of these cities became sort of like way stations for trade that was going to go north into Western Europe, like the Holy Roman Empire, all those Germanic principalities and kingdoms. They got all of their goods coming through Italy first. Plus, these city-states were broadly independent. They were not kingdoms. They were not ruled by monarchies. Instead, they were usually governed as republics. Remember, Rome had been a republic before it was an empire, and a lot of these city-states, as part of that kind of casting back to the growth and glory of the Roman era, kind of like look even further back and look at the Roman Republic. And so what they have are some form of representative government, particularly in Florence. And these republics were largely governed by people who were not noble. They did not inherit their status. Instead, their status was determined through their wealth. And that meant that merchants had a large role to play in terms of the politics of these city-states. So there's no king. Wealth becomes more important than nobility. So these are the various Italian city-states that are really important during the Renaissance. These states right here in this sort of lavender color, that right there, those are the papal states, and they are ruled directly by the Pope who lives here in the Vatican. The green area, this is the area dominated by Florence. Here's Siena. Venice is over here. That's where Venice is. Milan is way up here in the north, and there's Genoa for you. Particularly Milan and Genoa, these were the ones that had kind of the connections to the northern wing of the Renaissance. Now, so with the emphasis on wealth being more important than noble blood or kingship in these Italian city-states, what you have are some really interesting loopholes established through the Catholic Church, because historically the Catholic Church had not been really crazy about the notion of emphasizing wealth. If you remember, if you happen to know anything about Christian theology, Jesus rather famously preaches that it's easier for a camel to get through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to get into heaven. Jesus's message about justice and equality was really radical in terms of emphasizing the importance of the poor and the sinfulness of the rich. And the medieval Catholic Church had kind of taken that idea and run with it. And so as part of this notion that accruing wealth was not a sign of godliness, the medieval Catholic Church actually it considered it to be a sin to lend money at interest. So that essentially meant that being a banker was a sinful profession because it required that you lend money at interest. The Catholic Church referred to this as a sin of usury. And so what we see in the Renaissance is this really interesting theological transformation. The Catholic Church changes its mind. And basically, people start thinking that making profit is okay, so long as you do some stuff to mitigate the sinfulness of it. So, what happened was you would have all of these merchants and bankers who were making serious money by trading long distances or by lending money out so people could start new businesses. Like, technically, that was all really sinful behavior according to the church. And so, what they did was they took that money that they made. And then they made huge donations to the church. And they made these donations sometimes in cash, but they often made these donations in the form of art or in sponsoring new buildings. And so the church would kind of look away from the accruing of all of this money because they were benefiting from it. So you'd have these incredibly rich families who were like, yeah, we have all of these ducats, all of this gold, all of these florins. Those are all currencies. Okay. All of this money. And we're going to take some of it and we're going to sponsor artists and they're going to paint you a portrait of the Virgin Mary and the Christ child and you can hang it in your church and that'll make us good, right? Like it's not a sin if I use the money religiously. So, the best example of this is the Medici family in Florence. The Medicis were bankers. They were kind of rough bankers. They took a risk. They did high interest loans. They would like give people the chance to take out loans, but you didn't want to miss a payment. I don't want to say that these guys were kind of like the early version of the mafia, but they kind of were. They would definitely make you an offer you could not refuse, and you might find yourself with some kneecaps broken if you didn't pay. But the Medici became massively wealthy. And they became massively wealthy because they actually lent money directly to the Pope. In fact, people called them God's bankers. Now, so the Medici, they have all this money and they take this money. And then what they do is they fund great artists, people like Michelangelo, Raphael, Leonardo da Vinci. They all get the money directly through the Medici. So one of the ways that people are showing status and power during the Renaissance is through sponsoring art. And we're going to talk specifically about Renaissance art in a couple of days. And I really enjoy doing that, and I hope you do as well. So here's a quick sort of like foreshadowing of this. This right here is an incredibly famous work of art. This is known as the Pietà. It has the Virgin Mary here cradling the body of Christ after he has been taken off of the crucifix and been executed. And what's amazing about this work by Michelangelo is just how fluid the stone feels. This is one solid, singular piece of marble. And if you look right here, so you can see Mary's hand is pressing into the body of Christ. And you can even see the laxness of the muscles right here. It looks like if you actually push your fingers against a muscle or part of your arm, you can see the flesh move. Michelangelo has achieved that just with stone. That is incredible skill. And he was sponsored to make this great art by families of bankers and merchants, people who were trying to essentially mitigate the sin of usury by making these religious artistic donations. Now, I'm going to get into the topic of intellect and art here. Mostly we're going to be talking about political science and humanism, but it's kind of a weird place to like stop if I keep going. So I'm going to stop this video and then start another. Okay?